Hello, everyone, and welcome to a bonus episode of Decoding TV. I'm David Chen. Joining me today for this special episode, he is the creator and editor of one of the best television recap newsletters on the internet, Episodic Medium, over on the Substack. Myles McNutt, welcome back to Decoding TV.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. Today, we are here to discuss Dune Prophecy. I do want to recommend that you check out all of Miles's recaps of the show over at Episodic Medium at episodicmedium.substack.com. Great newsletter. But Miles, we have both watched the show. You watched it over the course of some weeks. I watched basically the entire show in the last 48 hours.
Yep.
And we're here to talk about whether it was good or bad, whether you should watch it or not. So let's get into it. Our conversation about season 1 of Dune Prophecy on Max, the one to watch for HBO.
The sisterhood draws women from many worlds.
Myles McNutt, before we talk about whether the show was a success or not, I am kind of curious. Let's rewind a couple months. Did you have any expectations for the show whatsoever? Like, what were you kind of hoping to get out of this?
It's weird. I think the thing that's so compelling about this is that Dune is such a clear cultural artifact at this moment in time that the Villeneuve movies have created this understanding of what the franchise is and what it looks like. And I think what's compelling from my perspective and what kind of stands out to me is that this is a prequel. And so we're meant to view it through that lens. They want us to view it through that lens. They want us to think it's a franchise. We love the Dune franchise. Let's get more Dune. And then you read the opening title crawl, and it's just 10,000 years in the past. It's like, wait a minute. So this is like a full 10,000 years. And so you're like, well, wait a minute. Okay, so then how do you then navigate that? And, I felt like this was sold and originally imagined as a sort of history of the Bene Gesserit, a part of the films and the franchise that I thought was inherently compelling and notable and interesting. And I'm like, that sounds great. I'm on board, more or less, with that idea. But then you realize that none of the creative team of the movies are involved. And so this is not a continuity of films that, although I find them narratively interesting, are really compelling from a stylistic perspective. And that's where a lot of sort of my relationship with them comes from. So it's just like, okay, then this is just something that is tangential, that is related, that is adjacent to. And I think those are really interesting places to be because they're not beholden to the same timeline. There's something you can do something new, remix things up. And
Right.
so when I actually saw it, it was just kind of like this is not interesting enough to excite me on its own merits.
Hmm.
Meaning it's riding on that affiliation in too many ways where I just sort of started to realize, hey, like something is off here in a way that's kind of hard to grasp, and which I think we spent 6 full episodes, all of which are 60 minutes long each, at least, kind of struggling over of just like, why isn't this working? And I think that that's a point where, like, listening to that trailer, even I was thinking to myself, gosh, like so much of the things that work about the show are in that trailer. And I'm just sort of like, how could that not be turned into a more compelling show than what we got, given the fact that I was already invested in this world on some level? And I think that makes it a particularly not troubling in the sense of like I'm so troubled by this, but rather it's just kind of like it's a point of frustration. Like there's an irritation of just like, why didn't this work? It's like I have sand in my eyes, I guess, is what I'm working with in that case.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you bring up some very good points about the show's making and its setting. For comparison, House of the Dragon takes place about 170 years before the birth of Daenerys Targaryen, who's a major character in Game of Thrones. This show, Dune Prophecy, takes place 10,000 years before the birth of Paul Atreides, who is the main character in the Dune franchise. And yet, they seem to be dealing with the same technology, the same sort of political dynamics, the same, cultural things that they're dealing with in the Dune movies you know and love. So, open question about why they had to set it so far in the past, because I feel like it's what's the opposite of having your cake and eating it too. It's basically you don't get the benefit of being directly connected to the Dune franchise, right? But you also like, because they're doing everything so tightly connected to what we know from the Dune movies out of necessity, they don't get to really split off and do their own totally new, completely different thing. You know what I'm saying?
No, and
So,
like I think the thing about it that stood out to me was the fact that okay, on the one hand, they've now argued and said, well, that's the whole point that this like technology was so terrifying that they were kind of
mhm,
trapped in this lack of progress, lest they retract back to that moment. That means we're at a crucial moment in history. But first and foremost, that's an interesting idea. It does not track on like
yeah,
a moment to moment of a TV show when
yeah,
you're trying to play that out. But also, all the family names are the same. It's still Harkonnen and Atreides. There's too much
yeah,
familiarity for us to fully disconnect from that. And so it's like if you want to suggest that and it's consistent with the franchise's themes. Everything is faded, right? The Bene Gesserit, that the Sisterhood are like manipulating all these bits of history, and that the reason things are still the same is because they chose that power. I'm okay with that as an idea, but as an actual like dramatic act, like a part of what a TV show is trying to accomplish, it's just distracting. And I think that it's one of those pieces where you just sort of think, okay, you have to take a step back and think to yourself, this might be part of the sort of spin-off novels that were written. This might be part of the lore that we understand. Will it register in a TV show? And I think that that's a question where like the people responsible for the show, unless I know this was originally developed in one context, taken over by somebody else. Villeneuve was supposed to be involved originally, and that all got
mhm,
thrown out. So I know it's been through some development hell, like so many projects have in this day and age. But I just kind of look back at it and think, like, some of this required like a page one rethink, not because none of it was good, but because it had those nagging things in there where it's just kind of like this could have worked so much more efficiently if there had just been that stopping point. It just seemed like it never came.
yeah, yeah. Let me also point this out, Miles, and I know you don't like to put things this crudely, but 10,000 years is a really freaking long time.
Hmm.
Like humanity is unrecognizable today compared to 10,000 years ago, right? And so the idea that in the future 10,000 years would have passed and literally almost nothing seems to have changed feels like it really stretches credulity. I want to read a quote from Episodic Medium newsletter. Myles McNutt writes about Dune Prophecy. It's a weird case study of a show that has been a dramaturgical failure. The idea is solid and the execution itself has been admirable, but there are some foundational choices as to how to construct the story that have kept it from building the connection it needs to be sustainable. End quote. So, Miles, you called Dune Prophecy a dramaturgical failure. Uh, part of this podcast is to answer the question: should people invest the time into watching the first 6 episodes of season one of Dune Prophecy, or these 6 episodes of season one of Dune Prophecy? It sounds like no, based off of that. But I'm curious, why do you think it's a dramaturgical failure, and do you think people should still watch the show?
So my big thing, and like this is something where I was watching episode to episode. They did
Yeah.
send out screeners for the first four. I watched them one by one, wrote about them. So I experienced this in the same way that viewers did on a week to week basis. And for me, my breaking point was episode three, which I want to be very clear, I thought was pretty good. If I were to go back and pick an episode of the show that I thought like had some bunch of interesting ideas in it, I would go with that. This is a flashback episode that's predominantly told through the perspectives of both Valia and Tula, these two sisters, telling these two different points of their origin story that give a sense of their family dynamic and the kind of relationship between them. And it's a really compelling episode in terms of like drawing some things out and expanding these characters. But I started to realize that between the first three episodes, probably about half of their runtime, all told, takes place in the past at a different point in time. And I started to realize like this is only a 6 episode TV show. How much of the show can take place in the past before we kind of become disconnected, where you start to realize like how can the balance of these things properly be met? And that became especially clear to me when we got to the end of the season and I started to realize like that whole third episode, they don't follow a huge part of the storylines. Like this is a 6 episode show and all the palace storylines happening in around the emperor just are completely gone and absent. And I'm just like, you only have 6 episodes. You only have so much real estate to
Right.
manage. Like, you let those stories drop and you create this, like, well, why are we paying attention to them? Right? Like, these clearly where you care about. You're giving all this time and attention. And when I get to the end of the season, what I realized was writing that final review is the flashback structure works great for the characters in the flashback. I actually think the way that story was mapped
Yeah.
out makes sense for where they want to land those characters, but
Yeah.
it does not make sense for the entire rest of the show. And it actually makes the entire rest of the show so much less satisfying,
Mhm.
to the point where you start to be like, why am I paying attention to this if it's all just this machination of these other pieces? And when I reached that, I was sort of realizing, like, did they know that? Like, did they realize, right, that they were creating this imbalance, or were they simply just trying to make a story work and just failed to recognize the sort of consequences? And I know this is a complicated process, that production, post production, all sorts of things can happen, but I'm just like, you executed so effectively these two different timelines of these two characters, and then just like failed to recognize the show you were building around them. And I think that that's what a dramaturgical failure looks like, where it's sort of like, it's not that the idea itself was the problem, is that
Mhm.
they never figured out how to string those things together into a coherent TV show, which may not be possible in 6 episodes, but it's certainly what they tried.
We should point out that the production was shut down because of the strikes, and so it is entirely possible that that had an impact on what they intended, on the episode order for this series. Uh, I feel similarly, but possibly for different reasons. You know, like I feel it was also dramaturgical failure. However, let me start with some good things. So, first of all, why should you watch Dune Prophecy? First of all, if you love the world of Dune, you will get more of the world of Dune in this show, literally to a fault, in my opinion, because very little has changed between the events of Dune Prophecy and Dune Part One. Then even Dune Part One. So, uh, the technology is the same. It looks the same. Like
Mhm.
some of the technology they use looks identical to what they use in the movies, and it looks really cool. You know, I'm not gonna say it's bad, but it's the same, and that's just weird that it hasn't changed in 10,000 years. And so but if you are looking for more, you're just like, I love the world of Dune. I want to spend more time on these various planets engaged in these political machinations. You will get that in Dune Prophecy. If you're interested in the origin story of the Bene Gesserit, you will definitely get that in Dune Prophecy. Like what are the details of how the Bene Gesserit came to be and how they operate? You will definitely get that in Dune Prophecy. I also think the cast is really amazing. I love Emily Watson as an actor. I'm so glad that she got an opportunity to essentially lead this show. Everyone in the show is excellent. Olivia Williams. I even like Travis Fimmel, who is plays Desmond Hart, and he played a extremely similar character in Raised by Wolves. Uh, Here, I think he barely plays a character, but he is such a compelling screen presence. Not talking about his performance. I'm talking about what's written on the page. He's such a compelling screen presence. He makes that character work for me. Um, Mark Strong, of course, playing the Emperor, and yeah, just like everyone in this show is top notch, doing great work. I also think the show looks spectacular. There's great CG. Not only that, but the physical sets look amazing, augmented with CG. It's just like, in my opinion, one of the best looking shows in television. It's doesn't look as good as the movies, but it's like sometimes it gets like pretty close. On occasion, it gets pretty close. So like, there's a lot of reasons to get into the show and watch the show. Having said all that, I don't think the show is very good. And but I don't think it's actively bad either. I think that I have very different lists of problems with the show, Miles. In my opinion, the show tries to do way too much in 6 episodes. And I don't think it really aligns on who the actual protagonist is. Like, it's difficult to tell who the protagonist is. To the extent that there is a protagonist, it's Mother Superior Valia Harkonnen, who, in my opinion, is a very problematic protagonist. Not like if you listed all these characters out and said what the role was and said who should be the protagonist of the story, that is not the one I would choose. Right? It would be kind of like making Littlefinger the protagonist of Game of Thrones, kind of like a character who kind of knows everything and is plotting, and it's like, okay, that's kind of interesting, but is that an ideal protagonist? I don't think so. You kind of want someone who's more of an audience surrogate, who is learning about this world and you're learning along with them. And I think that is ultimately like the fatal decision that makes season one pretty unsatisfying, is making Valia Harkonnen the main character to the
So
extent that she is, and she's
yeah.
barely the main character because the show
So
spends so much time with the other characters. Go ahead, Miles.
So I was gonna say, like when you said that, I saw you post about this and was sort of thinking
Yeah.
about it from a variety of perspectives. Two things really stood out to me in relation to that. One of them, from my perspective, is when you think about the characters and the dynamics. The first episode has so many potential protagonists.
Yes.
When you break it down,
Yeah.
you have Princess Inez, who
Yes.
seems to be heading towards the sisterhood, which would make her a logical
That
surrogate
would be the
figure.
most logical choice. Is Princess
Yeah.
Inez is the main character, right? That's
Yes.
what I was like. Maybe that's the show's going that way, right? Yeah.
And then you also have all the acolytes who are of her,
Yes.
where you're thinking we're going to follow them as they track
Yes.
through these elements and go from there. And you sort of think we're setting up this like tiered structure of like the head of the Bene Gesserit as
Yeah.
like the kind of like leadership focus, and then that going from there. But then like that story just never happens. It completely gets sidetracked. And so you end
Yeah.
up with this kind of like disconnect going there. But what it made me think of, and this is a very weird pull, and I apologize, but like I remember watching the Warcraft movie,
Wow.
and I remember
Deep
because
cut.
I did rewatch parts of that recently, and I remember thinking to myself that like they just did not decide whose perspective we were meant to be following. They're like, we're doing a fantasy epic. We're going
Right.
to track the orcs. We're going to track the humans. We're going to track the mage.
Right.
We're going to do all those things. And it's just like, no, no, no. You actually need to pick one. Like you actually, at a certain point, need to have an anchor for how you're going through that. And I think what you're right is that really what I think, if I had to guess what happened in that respect, I think it's that they sort of realized there was this tension between, okay, we're telling the origins of the Bene Gesserit, we need to focus on telling that history. And I think if you look at it from the flashbacks perspective, right? Flashback Valia Harkonnen makes more sense as a protagonist.
100%.
Right? If we're
100%.
telling that story,
Yeah.
her being trapped between that, what's happened in episode 3. The episode 3 story makes perfect sense of her as a
Yeah.
protagonist. But once you get to the episodes after that, it does feel like, I think, in the end, this ends with Valia and two other characters, traveling and sort of starting this whole journey, like they're low rent Doctor Who companions, as I wrote.
Yeah.
But like I realized at the time where it's like those characters feel so secondary by the time you get to the end of that season.
Yeah.
Like I don't really know their story, I don't really care about
Yeah.
them. The show has done none of the work to make that happen because everything has been about Valia and Tula. And again, I think that story works, but you're right that in terms of the impact it has on how you interpret everything else and you interpret the rest of those pieces, it is kind of a debilitating choice.
Yeah, it's kind of the fatal decision from which the show never recovers. They tried to do the Game of Thrones path. They tried to say, we don't need a protagonist. We can bounce around to all these. Game of Thrones is a once in a generation phenomenon, right? Like, very few shows can pull that off successfully. They tried to do it here. It didn't quite succeed. Then they kind of leaned on the Valia Tula relationship, and it kind of works, but then everything else suffers in comparison, and it's really brutal as a result.
I
So
think, and I think the thing too about the Game of Thrones comparison, I had a commenter sort of suggest that they enjoyed the show more than we did, and I'm like, that's great. I'm never mad. I'm truly never mad.
absolutely,
Right? Like I totally
100%.
understand this is a compelling thing. If you have a connection to it, that maybe tracks. But one of the things they sort of said was they were frustrated by all the comparisons to Game of Thrones that came up, feeling as though it's this unfair thing that we put on every fantasy show or every science fiction series, where it's like everything fits that mold. And I'm like, look, if you don't want to be compared to Game of Thrones, don't do what this show tried to do, which is so much of the Palace storyline felt
Yeah,
like the laziest copy paste. We talked about the use of sexposition, right, in the second episode. This felt so much like it's exactly the kind of scene you would have seen. It's almost identical to the Theon Rod scene that kind of helped spark that whole
hmm
process. Like, there's so many things going on there where it's like, look, they were cribbing from this, right? They were relying on this to try to make this work. And I have no doubt that that's a process of like getting notes from HBO, then Max, but still the same principle applies, right? It's, even though it became an HBO show retroactively, it was developed for Max,
yeah,
but all part of the
yeah,
same leadership. No doubt thinking, hey, we're losing Game of Thrones. We want to get that back. We want to connect with that audience. We're making all these spin-offs, but hey, if we can turn Dune, an already fantasy, franchise prospect, into another one of those examples, hey, that's great. We can manage that. But like Game of Thrones had 10 episodes every season in which could explore those issues. It also had books that had figured out, right? For all we can say about
yeah,
Martin's struggle later in the book series, those early books were so good at understanding how to balance those points of view and kind of figure them out accordingly. None of that, not a single stitch of it, is working in the context of what Dune is offering. And that's where it's kind of like you wonder to yourself, like, did they think this was working? Like, I know this is like one of the hardest things where it's just like this is not incompetent in the sense where it's like, gosh, they completely didn't realize it. It
Yeah.
just feels like they were trapped, that they were trying to meet too many masters, and what they created was salvaging the parts that they thought worked and letting the rest fall aside. And it's like that's why it's been frustrating seeing some of the postmortems and stuff come out that were very much just like super excited for season 2. We love where this is going, and I'm like, you should not love where this is going, right? Like I want some
You can like
basic
where this is going, but not like where this is right now,
right.
right?
Like I want you to think self-reflexively about like, hey, like how could we make adjustments? Like what did we learn from this? And I feel like that's just still not really a thing you can do, is to kind of like have that kind of honesty about where things went down and how that played out. But I do think this is a show that needs it. It's a show that I think could, right? I compare it a lot to The Acolyte, as an example of a show that I think made a bunch of mistakes in how to tell its story,
Yeah.
but had a bunch of interesting things at the core of that story that I totally think could extend compellingly into the future. The Acolyte was not given that chance. Dune
Yeah.
Prophecy has been. So, hey, like, challenge accepted. Curious to see what it looks like. But if they really think that this, like, oh, this worked, like, this totally tracked, like, we love the way this all played out, then we need to have a more serious conversation.
Let's talk about some of the stuff that actually happened in the season one. So it's the season one finale of Dune Prophecy. We've just talked about our overall thoughts on the show. Let's talk about where the series ends so far. And before we get to this, I want to comment on something that Miles said in his review, where he called it like a Wikipedia show, where you're better off just reading the list of events on Wikipedia and talking about those. That's more interesting than actually watching the show. I actually kind of disagree with that for the following reason. Myles McNutt, I spend a lot of time reading recaps. I write recaps sometimes. I read recaps on Wikipedia. I read recaps on Episodic Medium. I read recaps from brilliant folks such as friend of the show, Tara Ariano, brilliant writer in my opinion. I spend a lot of time reading recaps, and a really well done recap can be beautiful. Can be a wonderful read, lyrical. And I honestly feel that way about Wikipedia recaps sometimes too. I know this is like written by the masses, but sometimes I read a Wikipedia recap and I'm like, wow, that is I am impressed by the economy of words that they use to describe what happened in this episode. And let me tell you, I think I am being accurate when I say that the quality of Wikipedia recaps for Dune Prophecy is different than what I see for a typical show. And I would describe the difference as literally the Wikipedia recaps for Dune Prophecy are just a series of events. It's just nonstop events, and there is no artistry to them. And I know you're probably thinking to yourself, "Well, Dave, you're a moron for expecting artistry in Wikipedia recaps." I tell you, sir, my brother in Christ, I tell you that there are some Wikipedia recaps that are actually quite lovely. And this feels like they just needed it all to fit in the box. So they're just describing the events one by one. So I am now going to read from the Wikipedia recap of Dune Prophecy Season 1, Episode 6. And maybe you can tell what I'm talking about. Okay. So I'll just read a few sentences just to give you like a flavor of it. Okay. Tula sees Valia order Dorothea's suicide, then reveals her pregnancy. Valia shows Tula Eneral and plans mating Yaviko to Natalia. Nazir tells Tula fear feeds the virus but dies analyzing it. Natalia arrests Inez for trying to free Kieran. Valia gives Francesca a metacyanide gom jabbar to kill Yaviko. Yaviko unsuccessfully tries to send Natalia away. It's like in that style, right? And it's not all Wikipedia recaps are like that. Like
No, no, like just literally all you need to do is just like connect two thoughts together with a comma to indicate some sort of
right,
causality. And you'd
right,
already be at a much higher level of describing, like, just
yes,
like given this, following up on
yeah.
this, building
Now
off of that.
Now, maybe it's just that the person who was writing this one wasn't on their A game or they didn't have the A team. I would argue, however, that it is a sign of how this show is structured, which is largely as a series of events as
Mm.
opposed to things that connect to each other. And I think that's particularly clear in that there are multiple betrayals that happen later on this season. And I felt nothing, or I felt very little during those betrayals. There's two that I want to bring up right off the bat. Constantine, right, betrays the
Inez.
no, the
This.
Atreides swordmaster, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, Kieran.
Kieran, right? So Constantine betrays Kieran. It's like this big moment between the two of them where he's like, hey, I wanted to apologize, da 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 da, and I think that's supposed to be a big moment. Like you can imagine a world where these two had like a friendship and a rivalry, and then like one of them betrays the other. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing during that. I was like, oh, was this supposed to mean something to me? And then similarly, Natalia's betrayal of Yaviko in the final episode, I think that should be a thing where like, oh my god, I can't. This woman who suffered under this guy, this unfaithful guy for so long, and finally, I'm just like, okay, it's another thing that happened in the show. Like I felt very little emotional impact from these massive developments, and I think it's a result of the show just being like, and we're moving on to the next event, and next event, and next event, and next event, and there's no connective tissue. And I think part of that is because it's 6 episodes instead of 8 or 10, and part of that's just like the writers of the show and the style that they told the story, right?
Well, I think the other factor too is like that's something I noticed in the finale specifically was the finale adds new shades. The final two episodes contextualize both of those characters in fundamentally different ways that we had no access to at the beginning of the series. So,
Hmm.
like in terms of Constantine being the son of one of the sisters
Right.
from the flashbacks, played by Taboo Francesca in the later parts of the episode, a Indian movie star. And the idea there is that all of a sudden you realize, like, oh, this is like a child of the sisterhood planted here as part of these larger tasks. And but we don't know the story of like where that comes from. We see him in the first episode. We literally have no idea why he's a stepbrother, what
Right.
his connection is. We have nothing. Then in Natalia's case, the finale confirms that she was the match, the supercomputer named for Havako, but she was too young at the time, which is why Francesca became involved with Havako, was an effort to basically keep him busy so that he wouldn't
Yeah.
find another match in the time it would take her to come of age. But then she had to live with the reality of that as this sort of played out. And like, if you had told me all that information at the beginning of the show,
Hmm.
right? If you had used these
Yeah.
flashbacks and exposition
Right.
to establish those pieces of information, I would have better understood the stories you're telling. There still wouldn't be enough story. There still wouldn't be enough
Yeah.
substance to sell me on that. But at least what there was, I would have better understood as being connected to the core themes of what the show was offering. Instead, Constantine was just another fail son, right? He was
Hmm.
just another fail son struggling for daddy's attention,
Yeah.
and there was
Yeah.
no idea of what that meant or why that mattered. And those are good examples, I think, of just kind of like if you it makes sense for the Valia and Tula story if we don't learn that information until
Sure.
later, where it's
Yeah.
like a new twist in the darkness that they like would put on their friends and their order in order to advance these methods. All makes perfect sense from that perspective. But if you're trying to tell those palace stories and get me to care about them and make them matter, you need to prioritize like just dumping things in. But this maybe goes back to the whole argument about like the whole idea of like first season doing what a pilot should. That
Yeah.
instead of using the first episode to give you everything you need to interpret that show, you're like, well, as long as by the end of the first season we have everything we require, then we can really get started. And I think that is such a frustrating feeling in such a dense show when you're realizing it's just like, look, you don't have the luxury of soft footing around some of these pieces of information because it's going to take huge swaths of your show and render them, if not unintelligible, then certainly ineffective.
I would agree. I would agree with all that. I will say the Tula Valia flashbacks. I agree with you. That was some of the strongest stuff in the show, and particularly the flashbacks. Like, that should have been the show probably. Like, in my opinion, like the relationship between the two of them is really compelling. Whenever we cut to the present, I'm like, oh, this is so much less interesting than because the thing is, in an ideal state, right? They show the flashback, and the idea is Tula has sacrificed enormously for Valia over time, right? And then when they cut to the press, you're like, oh, like the weight of all these decisions, it hangs over them. And that did work a little bit for me, in particular when they have this exchange about how Tula couldn't share with Valia that like she gave birth to a son and hid him away. That was actually an effective moment. But in general, I felt like these two plot lines these two time frames didn't connect very well with each other, right? You have the past stuff that's like very compelling, And then you have the present stuff that's like feels very disconnected because the two characters are they're barely interacting the whole show, right? And so it's hard to make the past stuff have present day resonance, and what is there is not quite enough to make that separation worth it, in my opinion. Let's talk about some of the other stuff that happens in the finale. So, in your review, you pointed out one of the most baffling things to happen in this finale that I just still to this moment do not understand. There is a massive deal made about Theodosia impersonating Princess Inez. I think it's a multi-episode arc, right? Where uh, Valia says to Theodosia, "Hey, like, hey, are you ready to do this? You're the only one that can do this. We've prepared you your whole life to do this, right?" And then Theodosia shows up at the prison. They get Inez out of there because they think Inez is still critical to their plans. And Theodosia shows up. She looks like Inez. And it's like, you're here to replace Theodosia. It's like, whoa, wow. Like, I understand this is a big deal. Wow. Impersonating Inez, that's going to be hard to do. Like, she's going to need to trick, Natalia. She's going to need to trick Yaviko. She's going all her friends. Like, wow, that's going to be hard. No wonder why she needed so much preparation. Literally the next scene, Theodosia is impersonating a guard who stabs Desmond Hart ineffectively,
Yeah.
and then gets slapped, gets knocked unconscious, and that's it. What?
We don't
I
follow up. We don't figure it. So for the
I
record,
I cannot imagine that was the original intention for how that played out,
okay.
right?
And so the argument that people make is I'm like, this doesn't really make any sense
Yeah.
logically. And somebody pointed out that what happens from their perspective, which I accept this explanation
Yeah.
for what changed within the context of the diegesis of the TV show, which is that they showed up and Inez was like, no, Kieran's coming with us. And once that happened, whatever their plan was to put her back would no longer apply because now Kieran was going to be with them as well. So they
Mhm.
needed to pivot suddenly. Now,
I see.
which I say that still
Mm.
doesn't track. I don't find that to be clear, and if it's not clear to so many of us, I think that should kind of go from there. But more importantly, like I say, the amount of buildup this
Yeah.
story
Also,
has.
they could have just freed, quote unquote, just freed Kieran and left
Yeah,
Inez behind
right.
because what's her name? Valia theoretically has an interest in Kieran for some other reason, right?
Who
Like,
knows, right?
yeah,
You could have left this a mystery, like, but
yeah,
the idea that it was kind of like you build this up so much. Like, I remember I read an interview where they were talking about the actors who played Inez was talking about like working with the actors who played Theodosia to
right, right,
coordinate how they would speak and just
yeah.
like figure all these things out to try to sell it. And then you realize that it's truly not even a thing that's happening.
It's for like
And
30
it's
seconds.
just
For like
for
30
30
seconds.
seconds. And it's just like you create such a and I think there's a lot of moments in the show where it feels like it's building up to something. There's a moment of like, this is it. And then you realize it just kind of goes away. And the face dancing thing was a whole other issue when they revealed it the first time. Because when Theodosia first face dances, they've never set up this is a thing that can happen. They've never articulated it, and they don't show her transforming into Valia's brother. They just see Valia's brother, and she sees her, and then it's just sort of like, thank you, Theo. And to be honest with you, I regularly forgot the acolytes' names in this TV show.
Yeah,
There were four of them over time. They said Lila enough and Theodosia enough. I got them eventually.
yeah,
But the other two, I truly only would have to look it up in any given case. It's Jen and something else. And the idea is that like I wasn't tracking what was going on. They don't show her as Theodosia clearly. She's like deep in the shadow when they
yeah,
show her coming up. They show her picking up the rope, but I'm just like, if you want to be clear, they don't even talk about it in the next episode. They don't even like set up what it was or try
yeah,
to articulate it. And I'm just like, look, I fully understand you want to treat your audience in a certain way. Too much exposition feels clunky. We'd be complaining about that too. But I'm more concerned when something just does not make sense. And when it doesn't seem to be that much of a concern to you that it doesn't make sense. That's the point at which I start to wonder, like, did they do a pass of this to be like, is this going to actually track to an audience member who does not know what's happening?
yeah, yeah.
And I just feel like that got missed in this
I,
process.
I think you're right that even if the actual set of events is, oh, they're taking what's his name, Kieran, with them, so they need to change the plan. More deals should have been made out of that. They should have been
Yeah.
like, oh, we got to pivot. The original plan, which was to make you Inez, that's not going to work anymore. Now we're going to do this, like. But instead, it just ends up feeling like a wet fart of a whole like build up that leads to nothing. Um, okay, let's talk about other things that happen. We already talked about kind of the Yaviko and the Natalia storyline, and how like that didn't really feel like it hit because I think just not enough time was given to Natalia's motivations, in my opinion. Um, there is this whole thing where they reveal that the sisterhood has Dorothea, who possesses Lila, reveals that Valia made Dorothea's followers commit suicide. That she like opens up the pond and there's all these dead bodies down there. And I'm just gonna put this out there, Miles. Um, and you can accuse me of whatever you want. I just don't think Valia is somebody who I want to root for. First of all, she murdered a shit ton of people, which we see
Hmm.
this is horrifying, horrifying. To the show's credit, very well done. When she like forces everyone to kill themselves.
Yeah.
But then in this show, she is not competent. She is like not good at her job. She lets Desmond Hart get the upper hand on her multiple times. And so at the end of the day, I'm like, why am I rooting for this? Like, I don't believe in what she wants to achieve. I don't believe with her means with which she achieves it. I don't think she's even good at her job. Uh, that was tough for me because the climax of this episode is you're rooting for her to like overcome her fears, and I'm just like, I have a lot of other issues with her than her overcoming her fears. What did you think of Valley Harkonnen as kind of like the emotional linchpin for this episode?
So, I think back a lot on sort of like your early 2000s, the rise of the male anti-hero in
Yes, right.
TV. And it's very clear, I think, that they are sort of trying to assert where it's just like, no, like this is a female anti-hero.
Yeah,
This
this
is
is an
somebody.
anti-heroine. This is
Yes,
like what
like
they're
yeah,
trying to do,
that
right?
this
Yeah,
is somebody, and one of those cases where it's like, okay, I understand the logic behind that, and I think
yeah.
you look at
Same,
something like
same.
Thrones, you understand a character like Cersei, who is
Yes,
inherently trapped in these circumstances, right? But the
a
problem with
great
this.
version of an anti-hero, by the
Yes,
way. Yep.
absolutely. The problem with Valia, as you're sort of getting to, is that the ideology that she is operating under, right? Which is effectively the idea that the Bene Gesserit needs to function so that society and the Imperium serves in that notion. So they need to continue using, genetic manipulation and sort of population control on a wide scale in order to accomplish that goal, and that they need to do this using the thinking computer that gives them the power to do so, and that Dorothea and her followers are standing in the way of that happening.
Yeah.
And it's just like,
So we're
okay,
rooting for the genetic manipulation. Is that kind of
yes,
right?
that's effectively the situation they've created. And I'm kind of like, and I run this back in my head where it's just like, okay, let's run that back to the new films, right? Let's run it to Dunes Part 1 and 2, where it's just like the Bene Gesserit in the context of those films are just kind of like, no, they seem kind of bad. Like it seems like the power that they have over these forces, that it's a story about agency within this process of control, right? About thinking that how like Paul is simultaneously of that order, right? He is sort of like chosen in these forms, but then you start to balance between the sort of mythicism of the Fremen and the manipulation of the Bene Gesserit and understanding these forces operating. It's about those ideas. And here it's just kind of like you are kind of said, okay, so either we are saying this is all justified for some larger cause, which I think is a very difficult argument to make given the circumstances and given what we know about what's going on. But more importantly, like to your point,
So
like,
eugenics is bad, is what you're
right, I'm thinking maybe.
or we have to
Uh,
believe eugenics is good in order to
Right, you
root for this
kind of
character,
have to. But the other
right?
thing is that what is the alternative point of view? Right? Like,
Right.
what is the alternative perspective that gives us an idea of where this comes from? And it's like, it's this shadowy big bad. It's not Desmond anymore. We now
Yeah.
know that Desmond was implanted with this virus
Yeah.
and that his perspective has been warped by all these things. But there's just a shadowy figure out there that's allegedly more dangerous for one reason or another. But, like, again, what is the perceived danger? Is the danger to Valia and to Tula and the Sisterhood? Is it to the entire Imperium?
Yeah.
It feels very isolated. And that's the
Yeah.
weird thing. It feels very small that we're so focused on these one set of questions, which again is why I thought the Acolytes, I thought Inez, I thought some of these other characters would emerge as sort of
Yeah.
like they're the ones that we're tracking, because they're the ones gonna have to kind of carry this on and build from there.
All right, let's talk about just a few other things that happen in the rest of the episode. We talked again about how Yaviko kills himself, then Natalia kills Francesco with the needle. Very ironic. There is a scene where um, what do we call it? I'll just read here from the Wikipedia page. Young Tula exchanges Desmond for a stillborn. We kind of learn more about like how the deception originally happened, and that was actually genuinely moving. I thought
Yeah.
when they have that when she kind of has her baby, she swaps the baby and has to say goodbye to it. Like again, the young Tula and Valia stuff was very good.
Yeah, and I think the
Um,
Tula story in particular is sort of as like a counterpoint to that of understanding that like if Tula is still, we understand Tula I think is inherently guiltier about what she has done than Valia is, but she also is quite convinced I think that that's just who she is, right? And so the choice in the case of kind of like giving her baby up being built around of like I don't want Valia to have this child, right? Like I am concerned that if this child is as important as the computer says,
yeah,
right? That if Valia gets hold of him, that this will sort of like create even more trouble for this child that it doesn't deserve. That I'm already forced into this, that ultimately he shouldn't be. That all sort of resonates, and Olivia Williams sells the heck out of the adult part of it. We see the young part very effectively. All that kind of is working in process, but then it's just sort of like, does it make Desmond's Heart character make any more sense? Does it like track better with the way that story played out? Does it sell any of the other pieces of this? Does it deal with that, like you said, the separation, right? Tula and Valia spend almost no time together as adults
yeah.
after the first episode, and you start to realize like this isn't solving any problems, right? The best parts of the finale didn't really do much to address the parts of the show that didn't work. They just kind of affirmed the parts that did, and I think that's where it like wasn't maybe as restorative to the show's larger
hmm
reputation as a finale could have been if it had been more kind of global in that respect.
There is a scene where Lila shows the acolytes the skeletons underneath the river, and then she destroys Anirul. And I think you brought up the good point that that's weird because we know that they're still doing genetic engineering at the time of Dune. So like, what is the story they're going to tell about how they eventually found their way back to the genetic engineering? Like
Yeah.
it's an odd decision to make given we know where the story ends up. But yeah. And then we also there is this sort of big emotional moment that we already discussed where Valia spends a lot of time in this dream space overcoming her fears, and Tula and Valia have this conversation about Desmond being Tula's son, and that actually is meaningful. Then Tula goes to Desmond and he has her arrested, and that was actually also kind of poignant because you understand why he would do that. One of the issues I had with the show overall is Desmond. I just don't think is very much of a character. Sadly, I think he is mostly a set of emotions like anger and flippancy, and like he has an attitude, and that's mostly it. Like he doesn't really change at all through the entire
N-
season, right?
No, and also like when you find out that the virus was implanted inside of him, which is to say that like when he ends up in Shai-Hulud and he has his second life on Arrakis and all this,
Yeah.
none of that explains the zealotry, right?
hmm
Like, why is he such a zealot about this? Why is he so concerned about the sisterhood? He seems to be focused on the thinking machines, but why? Like, where does this radicalization come from? Is it just like born out of these ideas? Like, is he just like subconsciously like fighting back against the AI because he knows that it attacked him? Like, I just like the idea that he burns that kid, right? Where he's just sort of like, no, I don't like this match. I don't like the sisterhood's influence. And I'm just like, that is some like garden variety default antagonism without really a lot of motivation behind it. And
hmm
again, to the point, how Desmond plays out in this finale works great for Tula and Valia's story, but it does nothing for Desmond's,
Yeah. I mean,
right?
yeah. Like I said, he loved the actor. The character never changed. Did not have an arc, right? Like what? Where is Desmond at the beginning, and where is he at the end? He's literally in the same exact emotional place, and so Um, it's he's just kind of a Joker esque figure in there to kind of stir up things and create chaos. But I agree with you that he does work as motivators for Valia and Tula. And also, I thought his like powers were kind of cool. He has these fire starter capabilities and the ability to burn people alive, and how that manifested itself physically looked pretty cool. But yeah, I wish the show overall had spent some more time on the whole thinking machine stuff. They did it in the prologue, but that's arguably one of the most interesting things about the Dune franchise is why are there no computers, right? And the idea is that It is a tension that runs throughout this series, and yet I feel like the show does very little to explicate it. It just basically says they were evil, they almost killed us, and that's it. There's nothing about the philosophy of why we would not want them. It's just something I'm personally interested in. I'm not saying it's a flaw of the show, but I don't know. I felt
No,
like,
I
yeah,
mean, I think it's an idea, and it's one of those cases where, like, when I say Wikipedia show, it is unfortunate to be the actual Wikipedia summaries are so bad because I
yeah,
think you could write really good ones about this show that
absolutely,
would kind of pitch you on it. But like the thing about the idea of that prologue piece is like, hey, like this is a thinking machines, and like you get bits and pieces of that in terms of where this comes from, and the idea seems to be that the people on the fringes of society are willing to embrace thinking machines as a form of disruption of the standard order, that sort of forms of rebellion, like the rebels are using thinking machines in order to get their point across. The sisterhood is using thinking machines in order to manipulate these larger patterns. And that it's only sort of like the status quo, the normative sort of like central forces of power, which seem to be tied to this in terms of context. And I'm like, that's all super interesting. But when your like biggest proponent against thinking machines is this like fire starter Desmond Hart, where everything seems so just like radical in its framing, you don't get to see like, honestly, that's a case where I think it's everything about Desmond Hart is made for like excitement and spectacle.
right,
Whereas like the AI story would actually be best served by being more bureaucratic and being more kind of philosophical about like where these ideas come from, where they sit in society, how people sort of understand them. Like just there's so many again meaningful questions about this world and how it plays out, but none of the characters in and around it get to have a compelling relationship with that.
yeah.
It just kind
Basically,
of ends up being sitting there.
Miles is arguing for the centrist anti-thinking machine point of view,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah,
where are
like
the
just
centrists in this world? Why does it always have to be the ultra left? Those libs trying to mess things up for the thinking machines.
too. It's
It's
too
not.
woke. It's too
It's too
woke.
woke.
That's the
The
takeaway.
reason we can't have that, Miles, of what you wanted, is because of woke. That's why.
See, and I was thinking to myself that, like, unlike the Acolyte, which people claimed was woke, and that was one of its concerns, I'm like,
Yeah,
you can't argue Doom Prophecy is woke, but now we just did. It's
yeah,
amazing. It's
absolutely,
amazing
absolutely.
how everything boils down to that. What a time! What a time to be alive.
So we learned that, yeah, there was another evil force, and that's probably going to be the big bad of the show, the enemy we find out in season 2, the one that gave the virus to Desmond and let him light people on fire, and is presumably AI or thinking machine related, right?
Yes,
So
so the
yeah,
idea that he's, and again, they say he's using a thinking machine in the image. I want to be very clear. That image of like his eye getting
yes,
sucked out of his head and then like getting implanted and like going from there is some really hellish stuff.
I
And
agree.
like, I'm fully on board. I loved it. I thought it was very effective. But again, just the idea of getting to the end of 6 seasons, like 6 episodes of a TV show, and realizing, oh, what you thought was the antagonist figure of this process
Hmm.
is just a pawn of this larger shadowy kind of
Hmm.
process, but I have no information to go on about that. Like, I
Yeah,
truly could not give you anything. Like, I felt like there was nary a crumb of like some larger thing that I could attribute to that.
right.
So like there's nothing to speculate on, there's nothing for me to like think about in relation to that. I'm just sort of like, what am I meant to do with that?
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of which, the episode ends with Valia, Kieran, and Inez landing on Arrakis. And what do you understand the next step of this to be? Like, what do yeah, like,
It's the thing. So, like, right off the bat, I'm like immediately sort of one of the things to show, I think, for anybody who is sort of like who came to Dune through the movies, which I think is a lot of us, right? Like,
yeah,
as much as obviously there's the Lynch film, there's the miniseries from the 2000s, there's lots of other entry points. The novels, of course, have long been a success story. But I think a lot of us are coming from the films. And it's like the way they talk about Arrakis in this show feels like they're drafting off of that. They're just like, remember Arrakis? You know
yeah.
what
Remember?
Arrakis is?
Well,
Like,
okay. So presumably that is the place where Desmond's enemy
yes.
is, and so they're gonna go find it there. But like, as you just said, we got very little to go on as an
And
like not even like a lot to be excited about as an audience is the problem. Like we're like,
no.
I don't even know what even to conceive of what the enemy might be, right?
So
Like,
there's two things. There's two things for me about this that plays out. One of them is like I did think that the character of Michaela, also weirdly like excised from the narrative once her part ended, but she was a Fremen member of the Sisterhood who was operating, within the palace environment, who gets burned in the midst of trying to take out Desmond, and then presumably goes back to Arrakis. So if we're going to see more of her, I'm okay with that. I thought she was interesting and compelling, and I would like to see.
Yes,
But
total badass of a character, in my opinion.
But then the other piece that ended up lining up with Arrakis was the idea that the Emperor, in regaining control of Arrakis and managing this, sent Constantine, the Failson, to Arrakis to lead the fleet.
Right.
And that happened in the penultimate episode.
Yes.
And yet he is not in the finale at all.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, you had an entire narrative about a character that played out across this entire season. You're going to have his mother get murdered, his father killing himself, all in this finale. And you're going to put him in and around the planet where allegedly the drama of the show is moving to next season. And you're not even going to acknowledge his existence.
Give us a montage, Give us a montage with some music and a slow motion shot of him walking towards some ships or something, like something.
And the thing is, that scene starts with the ship approaching Arrakis, which means he's theoretically in one of those ships around it, and yet nothing. And you just sort of realize, like, oh, there was no capacity within the context of this narrative to actually try to tie all these things together. Right? Like the loose ends, the pieces of this, no attempt was made in 82 minutes to get any of these pieces to actually go together, to cohere, to like come into some sort of agreement. And so you end up with this idea of like, okay, she is on Arrakis with Inez and Kieran. So she's with she has to work with an Atreides. She has to get this princess who they still think is sort of the key to all of this on the throne, but they also have to deal with the threat that's coming against them and being able to manage that. And to which I say, okay, are we forgetting about the entire palace storyline? Right? Or are we still going to be trying to do that at the same time? Because if that's the case, you're still going to follow the acolytes, who we get no resolution of like what's going on there. And the other acolytes are just like, we need to tell Tula what's going on with Lila. And I'm like, are they going to let her? Like, surely they understand. Like, is she going to face trial? Like, there's just so little clarity on that I look at it and say, if they just pick up the ball where they left it and try to run with this, we're going to run into exactly the same problems in a season 2, right? Like if they truly just take where things were left off, this did not simplify. This did not like coalesce.
Well, you killed a few characters, so that does help a little bit.
That's helpful, but like not enough to really fix the core of the problems. And so it's just like, it's like, is Lila Dorothea forever? Like all these things playing out, and I'm just like, they announced season 2 renewal right before the episode aired, so I knew going into it when I went to watch it that a season 2 had been ordered, that it was happening, and I was hoping, I was left with enough understanding where it's like, look, I want to see where they take Valia and Tula as characters. I think the performances are compelling enough, the production is designed good. I'd watch a season 2, but like not with a great deal of confidence that they understand where the problems were. Because this finale really kind of probably had more chance to try to clear a deck than it took. And I wonder, until I see like a season 2 like casting update where it's like, they're getting rid of all these characters, I won't feel too confident about their ability to juggle these balls when the time comes.
Well, sadly, I feel the same. Dune Prophecy, a show with a lot of potential, but sadly didn't live up to it this season. However, we have seen shows right themselves in the second season. There were some production constraints on season 1, and maybe that explains a significant chunk of the problems we saw. So who knows? There's still a lot of hope for this show. I am really glad to have been able to watch the show and follow Myles' coverage of it and kind of think through how a show like this works and how it could be successful. So I've had a great time talking about the show with you, Myles, and I really appreciate you spending time sharing your insights with the Decoding TV audience. But yeah, Myles McNutt is the creator and editor of the Episodic Medium newsletter at episodicmedium.substack.com. Subscribe to the newsletter. Check it out. It's one of the best resources out there if you're a TV obsessive. Myles McNutt, thanks for chatting with me today on Decoding TV.
Thanks, Sam.
Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.